Did other did other people really see the music video for Don't Come Around Here No More and not make it their personality? No set dressing today. We die like men. That's not true. If I look exceptionally tired today, just lean into that interpretation. So, come on, voice. So today I'm talking about literary nonsense. And if you are thinking, oh, you got dressed up for this, no, I looked at myself and said, yeah, I could do that. So here's where we're gonna go. I have an essay I wrote about this. But I'm really not where I need to be with the editing chops that I should have for it. So we're gonna go on a journey, you and I. Us. Compadres. It'll be fun. We're gonna have fun. It'll be fun. So when I set out to do this particular video, I ran into a snag. The snag being that I, A, am nowhere near as good at video editing as I want to be. I'm learning. You're watching my attempts to teach myself. But 2, I'm gonna need to talk about Edward. I tried to thrift a fur coat for this one, but they just creeped me out too much and I couldn't do it. Not even like faux fur. Though later in life, Edward Gorey did leave most of his estate to animal shelters and to the care of his house, the Elephant House, which is now a museum, he was known for years for sauntering into ballet houses in his raccoon furs. I'm going to begin by ending him. Edward Gorey died of a heart attack in 1999, which his friend, who was visiting, thought was a prank. Which is, I assume, how I will die. So, Tedward. Ted was... I'm calling him Ted like we're friends. I am deeply assured that if Edward Gorey were alive, and for whatever reason knew about me, he would find me remarkably frivolous, and I would be actively attempting to steal his identity. Edward Gorey was a genius, and I am not saying that just as a fan. Early in life, Gorey was considered a genius, a fact his mother overzealously stressed to everyone, with anecdotes that she would stop people on the street to show him off and tell them his IQ. Gorey supposedly taught himself to read and was reading adult novels by age 2, often brought up in interviews that at a time when others were still babbling, Gorey was reading Dracula. His cousins, who he was extremely close to, often made fun of him for this. It haunted Gorey for most of his life that his mother so little valued his privacy. He was very private, very averse to attention grabbing. He frequently wrote and created under many pseudonyms. He referred to himself and his characterization as a put-on. But he still pursued attention and artistic notoriety. The cognitive dissonance of wanting to be known and wanting to hide is played out throughout his career. There was always a sense that he was rebelling from this very overbearing mother and her expectations by trying to push the limits on what is identity by diving into nonsense. Literary nonsense. Nonsense is not a pejorative in literature, it's a subtype. And it's one that I think we have done a great disservice in not being taught. It's treated as a sort of special interest. Only real nerds know about this from my experience. But literary nonsense was Edward Gorey's sanctuary, and Edward Gorey is an influence for just about every cool person you know. The most famous example of literary nonsense, arguably, is, of course, Fury said to the mouse that he found in his house, "Come, we must go to law. I'll prosecute you. I'll have no denial. We must have a trial, for this morning I've nothing to do." Said the mouse to the cur, "Such a trial, dear sir, with no jury nor judge would be wasting our breath." "I'll be judge and I'll be jury," said the cunning old Fury. "I'll try the whole cause and condemn you to death." I memorized that in high school, along with some other weird choices I made. Lewis Carroll, not Edward Gorey's favorite nonsense author or biggest influence, but arguably the best-known nonsense author. Literary nonsense is a broad categorization of writing that balances what makes sense with what doesn't. It relies on non-traditional humor that emphasizes wordplay and subverted expectations more than it does reaching a punchline. All humor is about tension and release. You subvert an expectation when monologuing, you prod at a social issue, you raise the tension of a room, then you rely on wit to hit a punchline that releases the tension, bringing us all back to baseline. It's a fun experiment in glucocorticoids. Literary nonsense is humor without punchline. You eventually laugh or are charmed or buy in because you have to. Your brain wants to make sense of it. This is often called whimsy. It relies on an overabundance of meaning, not a lack of it, to become meaningless because it has no context. Let's look at the Treacle sisters. 3 sisters, the Liddell sisters, one of whom Alice is based on, who Dodgson was a tutor and family friend of, and who he had a bit of an odd fixation, which some people like to really look into, while Dodgson was, by all accounts, just a very weird, most likely asexual man with some neurospicy elements, are at a well full of treacle, which for Americans is any uncrystallized syrup, like golden syrup, or I guess molasses counts. Anyway, the Dormouse tells the story at the Mad Hatter and March Hare's tea party of 3 sisters, Lacey, which is an anagram of Alice, Elsie and Tilly, which were Alice Liddell's sisters, Lorena and Edith, who live in a well, and Alice asks the Dormouse what they ate if they lived in the bottom of a well, and the Dormouse says it was a treacle well. Which is ridiculous, except that it's a reference to St. Margaret's Well, because the origin of the word treacle is theriac, which was a panacea in ancient Greece, which is a pun on a medieval story of St. Margaret's Well in 12th century Oxford, which was itself a misrepresentation of St. Friedswald, the patron saint of Oxford, who, bound to celibacy, fled a prince seeking to marry her, and he gets struck by lightning, goes blind, and she feels bad about it, and a magical well happens to cure blindness. Or the Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy were the bower groves, and the mumrad saw grabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, with the jaws that bite and claws that snatch. Beware the Jub bird and Firmius Bandersnatch. That's enough. We don't need the whole poem. That's another one I memorized as a child. The point is not that the words are completely meaningless, but that they might as well be because you don't know the context. It all exists in Dodgson's head. Jabberwocky isn't completely nonsense words. It's not gibberish. It's portmanteaus. And portmanteaus of rhyming words. But without a key, we have no idea what any of those things are. We can only follow the bits of the story that are recognizable to draw on our own conclusions based on our own expectations. And that's literary nonsense in a nutshell. Literary nonsense is inspired by nursery rhymes and Mother Goose type stories, which are considered the first form of literary nonsense. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle kind of means nothing. In the 19th century, literary nonsense became associated with poets and authors actively attempting to push boundaries, either doing it almost unintentionally because they're a very weird guy with a hyperfixation like Charles Dodgson, or doing it very, very, very intentionally, like James Joyce. No, I don't have the time. Not in this or any lifetime will I have the time to talk about Ulysses. But know that I want to. Popular authors of nonsense literature today would be people like Douglas Adams. Eric Idle is considered a nonsense writer. Dr. Seuss. Weird Al. I'm gonna need to talk about Andy Kaufman someday, aren't I? But I must return to the framing device. Edward Gorey was very influenced by the work of Edward Lear. Edward Lear, author of the Book of Nonsense, and whose work went on to influence the Rankin Bass Saturday morning cartoons in the 1970s, was known for his nonsense verse, particularly limericks, which he popularized. Edward Lear had a difficult childhood with frequent grand mal seizures, asthma, chronic bronchitis, and other health problems that led to a lifelong fear and shame of exposing his health conditions in public. eventually leading to what Lear called the Morbids. Lear began to show signs of severe depression as young as 7 years old. Throughout his life, he was a committed artist, an amazing artist, who traveled extensively, determined to illustrate poems, particularly the works of Alfred Lord Tennyson, which he accomplished, and the two were friends. Perhaps between the Morbids and his traveling and art, though, Lear was largely isolated and had difficulty maintaining relationships, particularly male relationships. He proposed twice to the same woman, 46 years his senior, and was rejected both times. He otherwise lamented his infatuation with men. His greatest companionship was with Franklin Lushington, who didn't fully return his feelings. Their continued friendship and closeness, despite the lack of reciprocation, troubled Lear for the rest of his life and was a huge source of melancholy. It isn't surprising that Edward Gorey followed a similar trajectory. Often assumed to have been asexual because of his ambivalent attitude towards sex and romance, Gorey wrote beautifully regarding his unreciprocated feelings, and after a traumatic relationship early in life, decided to forego romance altogether, though he did go to gay and lesbian bars with his friends, mostly with his lesbian friends. He launched himself instead into illustration, writing, puppetry, and stage work. Gorey's artistic style, even his beard, was thought to have been inspired by Lear directly. It seems like there is a through line. No matter which nonsense artist you're talking about, these are people who were inspired by connection to others through the complexity of their art. It's a way of showing off, highlighting the cleverness of the intricacies of their work, like a vast network of intensely private jokes being shown off in public. And when they got others to laugh at it or enjoy it, it was more validating than other writing styles because, yes, one of us. Cleverness of the intricacies of their work. Fucking hell. What? The only way I can experience happiness again is with an Egypt break. The Victorian practice of eating mummies is widely contested about whether or not it actually happened. There are some people who ate mummies. That did occur. But it's thought to have been the result of a mistranslation rather than the intention of eating mummies. In medieval Europe, there was a substance called mumia, which was considered a panacea. People are dumb. Mummies, mumia, it sounded similar enough that some people just, they thought that it was a prescription to eat mummies, that eating mummies would give them some sort of advantage and longevity. It's just not. Don't eat dead stuff. George MacDonald is not a nonsense writer. He was an upsettingly linear man by all accounts, but a close friend of Charles Dodgson. Oh my, I keep calling him Dodgson. Sorry. Here's an example of nonsense for you. Charles Ludwig Dodgson. In Latin, Carolus Ludovicus. Back in English, Carol Lewis. Switched it around, Lewis Carroll. Anyway, George MacDonald was close friends with Lewis Carroll and read several of his manuscripts before publication, and I am an idiot and a completionist, and I read all several thousand pages of George MacDonald's complete works for no fucking reason. Well, there's the reason that he's the father of modern fantasy. All of these guys and concepts kind of are buddies, born out of a creative explosion rebelling against Victorian society. This is when Impressionism was getting its footing too. These artistic shifts are all deeply rooted in the political atmosphere of the time, which was heavily imperialist. And you see upswings in popularity of nonsense humor, we can creep into Dadaism someday, during times of political spiciness that include forcing traditional values. I want to be sure you hear the quotations around traditional values. It's crazy how people make shit up and call it a tradition within a single generation. George MacDonald would go on to be a primary influence on L. Frank Baum, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Chesterton. The list is unending, ever-growing. His fairy tale collections shaped modern fairy tale telling, and, like many Victorian things, we just assumed that's the way it always was. It wasn't. It was this guy. This guy! But he didn't write nonsense, so why am I talking about him? Alice in Wonderland is one of the most global, enduring, extremist examples of literary nonsense of this time period. MacDonald is the one who convinced Lewis Carroll to get it published. MacDonald is so influential to literature in a way that demands its own video that I just kind of can't forgive myself if I don't give him a nod here too. If a text only applies occasional concepts from literary nonsense, then it is not considered in genre. To be literary nonsense, you have to go whole hog. So that means, to be considered literary nonsense, it must include elements which both have and negate meaning simultaneously through manipulation of syntax, pun, grammar, portmanteau, phonetic meanings, context, representations. Gibberish, or fantasy in general even, can be mistaken for literary nonsense because nonsense can employ fantastic elements. But George MacDonald and Lewis Carroll would have you know, they're not the same. The distinction is in the linear and coherent nature of storytelling. Employing fantastic beasts and riddles and puns isn't enough to be nonsense. Nonsense, I think, is actually much, much harder. So what classifies as modern nonsense? I mentioned Douglas Adams already. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is often included into the realm of literary nonsense because it relies so heavily on the audience not getting everything, but getting enough, and faking what they don't get. It is true, and a personal anecdote, that I have owned over the years many copies of Hitchhiker's Guide, compendiums, collections, whatevers, and they all inevitably go missing. I loan books out to people all the time, and that one never seems to make its way back. So I hope they're doing well wherever they are. I even once had someone stop me as I was complaining about loss of said book to say, "Oh my god, it was yours?" Apparently had traveled around a whole art department. I made myself go check. I do have one. In terms of modern literary nonsense authors, however, there's really no one who quite makes the mark that Edward Gorey did. Edward Gorey popularized not only through his art, which initially took off as illustrations of covers of great literature. Edward Gorey popularized the abecedarium, which is his quaint term for a book that is based on the ABCs. Most famously is Gorey's own work, The Gashley Crumb Tinies. A is for Amy, who fell down the stairs. B is for Basil, assaulted by bears. C is for Clara, who wasted away. D is for Desmond, thrown out of a sleigh. E is for Ernest, who choked on a peach. F is for Fanny, sucked dry by a leech. These sort of mocking children's books written by Edward Gorey were some of his most famous works, and he loved writing the abecedariums, ABCDE ariums, which is a term I have seen conscripted in magical tourism. I have seen people who have referred to themselves in their magical journey as abecedarium. And that leads into another essay I'm going to be doing on magical tourism. But for now, it's important to know that Gorey is the one who popularized this art form. Gorey was also famous and famously infuriating to publishers for making art that didn't quite fit in the medium it was meant to fit in. And a famous example of that would be when he drew, he hand drew the entire set for the 1970s stage production of Dracula on Broadway. And he was infuriated that all of his images had to be blown up to fit on the set because he had painstakingly drawn each and every piece of it. Gorey was a perfectionist, and a very strict one at that. If you'd like to learn more about Edward Gorey, I would recommend Born to be Posthumous by Mark Deary. This is an excellent book I read about 2 summers ago. I really, really enjoyed it. If you're interested in donating to the Edward Gorey Charitable Trust, which goes to benefit not only the conservation of his creative legacy, but animal welfare causes that he created, you can do so. I'll include the link below. It really is one of the most difficult literary forms. And to become any sort of player in that form is an amazing feat, and it's one that really needs to be celebrated. For more information on this topic, sources, and other content, please look at the associated blog post on aliactus.com. That's ALIACTAST.com. The blog updates with weekly book reviews and essays on Saturdays. If you liked this, like it and share whatever you feel you gotta do. There are monthly video essays the last week of every month and a plethora of random shit in between. Thank you so much for listening.